David never imagined that what he believed was his wife's betrayal would reveal a much darker truth about assault, family dysfunction, and the complex ways trauma manifests in relationships. At 34, he thought he was dealing with infidelity and an unwanted pregnancy, but the reality was far more complicated and heartbreaking than he could have anticipated.
The story began with what seemed like a straightforward case of marital betrayal. David discovered that his 33-year-old wife Anna had been involved with another man, and she was now pregnant. The discovery shattered his world, especially because they already had 2 young sons together and had built what seemed like a strong marriage over many years. Anna and David were high school sweethearts whose families had been friends for generations. Their relationship wasn't just a marriage, it was the foundation of an entire extended family network. When the crisis hit, both families immediately rallied around them, urging David to forgive Anna and stay together for the children. The pressure from family members was immense and consistent. They called it a one-time mistake and urged David not to give up all the good because of one bad. This kind of family intervention is common in close-knit communities where divorce is seen as a failure that affects everyone, not just the couple involved. But the situation was complicated by Anna's pregnancy. David had moved out and blocked her contact, learning about the pregnancy secondhand through his mother. The timing raised immediate questions about paternity, a concern that would torture David while he waited for DNA results to determine whether he was the father. Anna's initial response to the crisis seemed to confirm David's worst fears about her character. She cried constantly, begged for forgiveness, and made emotional appeals that felt manipulative rather than genuine. When David demanded a paternity test, she readily agreed and promised to terminate the pregnancy if the child wasn't his. Have you ever discovered that a situation you thought you understood completely was actually something much more serious? How did the truth change your perspective? The waiting period for DNA results created a unique form of torture for David. He found himself hoping the child wasn't his because it would make leaving easier, but also dreading the idea that his wife had been willing to carry another man's baby. The contradiction in his own emotions reflected the impossible situation he'd been placed in. What made the situation even more confusing was Anna's behavior during what David believed was her affair. Unlike the typical patterns described in infidelity stories, Anna hadn't withdrawn from their marriage, neglected their children, or treated David poorly. She remained a loving mother and attentive wife even while allegedly betraying him. David had read countless stories about cheating spouses who became distant, critical, or emotionally unavailable to their families while conducting affairs. But Anna exhibited none of these behaviors. She continued to be the same woman he'd fallen in love with, which made her apparent betrayal even more incomprehensible. Even the text messages David found painted a confusing picture. While there was evidence of contact with another man, many of the messages included declarations of love for David and references to their happy marriage. This contradiction between her alleged affair and her continued devotion to their relationship defied explanation. David's confusion about Anna's motivations reflected a common misunderstanding about why people have affairs. He'd assumed that infidelity was always about dissatisfaction at home, that people cheated because they weren't getting something they needed from their spouse. Anna's case challenged this assumption entirely. The psychological impact on David was severe. He felt disgusted by the possibility that the baby was his, viewing it as evidence of Anna's inability to commit to anyone fully. He couldn't understand how she could be intimate with both him and another man simultaneously, sharing her deepest thoughts and feelings with a stranger while maintaining their marriage. Anna's suicidal threats added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. She would hug their sons while crying and talk about ending her life, creating additional emotional manipulation that made David feel trapped between protecting his children and protecting himself from further harm. How do you handle family members who take your spouse's side during a marriage crisis? What boundaries do you set when your support system becomes part of the problem? The family pressure continued throughout this crisis, with David's own sister visiting Anna regularly while barely checking on David himself. This betrayal by his support system added to his isolation and confusion about who he could trust during the most difficult period of his life. When David finally decided to confront Anna directly, demanding complete honesty about what had happened, she made an unusual request. She wanted his sister present during their conversation. This request raised David's fears that his sister might have been complicit in hiding Anna's affair. The revelation that emerged from this confrontation completely recontextualized everything David thought he knew about the situation. Anna showed him evidence that revealed the truth. What David had interpreted as cheating was actually sexual assault by Anna's older cousin, a man who had been harassing her for years. The cousin had a long history of inappropriate behavior toward Anna, beginning even before she met David. The harassment had continued over the years, but Anna had never reported it because both families subscribed to a family comes before all mentality that prioritized keeping problems internal rather than seeking justice. When the cousin returned to their hometown 3 months earlier, the harassment escalated to stalking and constant unwanted contact. Anna's text messages declaring her love for David and happiness in their marriage weren't communications with an affair partner. They were desperate attempts to convince her harasser that she wasn't available. Anna had tried various strategies to make the harassment stop, including sending intimate videos of herself and David to try to shame the cousin into leaving her alone. She had mocked him and insisted that David was a better man, hoping to discourage his pursuit. These actions backfired and seemed to trigger the assault. How do we better support assault survivors who blame themselves for their attack? What signs of trauma do we often misinterpret as something else? The most heartbreaking revelation was Anna's self-blame for the assault. She believed that her goading and engaging with her harasser had caused the attack, and she was convinced that if she had simply ignored him, none of this would have happened. This self-blame kept her from reporting the assault or seeking help. Anna's response to the trauma followed patterns common among assault survivors: self-blame, secrecy, and attempts to maintain normalcy. Her constant crying and emotional instability weren't signs of guilt about cheating. They were trauma responses to sexual assault that she'd been carrying alone. The DNA results confirmed that David was the father, which brought both relief and new challenges. While he was glad not to be dealing with another man's child, he now had to process the fact that his wife had been assaulted and was carrying his baby while dealing with unprocessed trauma. Anna's immediate return to taking birth control after the assault showed her determination to ensure that any pregnancy would be David's child. Her repeated promises to terminate the pregnancy if it wasn't his reflected her desperation to maintain some control over her reproductive choices after they'd been violated. The revelation reframed every aspect of their crisis. Anna's emotional manipulation wasn't calculated betrayal, it was trauma response. Her inability to explain her cheating wasn't because she was lying, but because she was processing assault. Her suicidal ideation wasn't guilt over infidelity, it was the devastating impact of sexual violence. David's journey from believing he was a betrayed husband to understanding he was married to an assault survivor required a complete shift in perspective. The anger and disgust he'd felt needed to be redirected from Anna to the person who had actually harmed their family. The family pressure to forgive and forget took on new meaning once the truth emerged. While their intentions may have been good, The family's intervention had actually prevented Anna from getting the support she needed and had isolated David from understanding what had really happened.
Professional therapy became essential for both Anna and David. Anna needed trauma counseling to process the assault and learn healthier coping mechanisms. David needed support to process his own trauma from believing he'd been betrayed and to learn how to support an assault survivor.
What does healthy support look like for couples dealing with the aftermath of sexual assault? How do you rebuild intimacy and trust when trauma is involved? David's decision to pursue temporary separation while Anna received treatment showed wisdom about the complexity of their situation. Simply returning to their previous normal wouldn't address the underlying trauma that had affected their entire relationship, including their first intimate encounter years earlier.
The revelation that Anna's cousin had been obsessing over her virginity and that this obsession had influenced the timing of her first intimate experience with David added another layer of violation to their story. Anna's entire sexual history had been shaped by this predator's actions. Anna's unhealthy coping mechanisms, from sending intimate videos to using sex as a way to manage David's emotions, reflected years of conditioning by someone who had sexualized and objectified her. Recovery would require unlearning these trauma responses and developing healthier relationship patterns.
David's initial hatred for the unborn baby transformed into protection once he understood the circumstances of conception. The child was innocent and deserved love regardless of the traumatic circumstances surrounding the pregnancy. This shift in perspective showed David's capacity for growth and healing. The legal separation David chose wasn't punishment for Anna, but recognition that healing required space and professional intervention. Staying together without addressing the trauma would have perpetuated unhealthy patterns and prevented genuine recovery for both of them.
David's acknowledgement that he wasn't qualified to be Anna's therapist showed mature understanding of the situation's complexity. Love alone wasn't enough to heal trauma. Professional intervention was necessary to address the deep psychological wounds that had been inflicted. The story highlighted how sexual assault affects entire families, not just direct victims. David and their children were all secondary victims who needed support and understanding as they processed this revelation and its implications for their family's future.
Community support through Reddit helped David gain perspective and confidence to protect himself and his family while still supporting Anna through her recovery. The advice he received validated his need for boundaries and self-protection while encouraging compassion for his wife's situation. The transformation of David's understanding from betrayed husband to supportive partner of an assault survivor demonstrated the importance of seeking truth rather than accepting surface explanations for complex relationship problems. Anna's long-term recovery would require addressing not just the recent assault, but years of harassment and the impact it had on her relationship with sexuality, trust, and communication. The healing process would likely take years and require ongoing professional support.
David's commitment to supporting Anna while protecting himself and their children showed the complexity of loving someone through trauma recovery. It required balancing compassion with boundaries, understanding with self-preservation. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that relationship crises often have deeper roots than they initially appear to have. What seems like betrayal might be trauma. What looks like manipulation might be survival tactics. And what appears to be guilt might actually be shame over victimization. The family's stay together for the kids pressure, while well-intentioned, had actually prevented the truth from emerging and delayed necessary healing. Sometimes the most loving thing a family can do is support professional intervention rather than trying to manage complex trauma within the family system. David and Anna's journey toward healing would require rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of truth,
professional support, and understanding of how trauma had shaped their entire history together. Their story offers hope that love, combined with proper support, can survive even the most devastating revelations. The courage required to face such difficult truths and commit to the hard work of healing demonstrated the depth of their commitment to each other and their family. Their willingness to seek help rather than ignore the problem showed maturity that would serve them well in recovery. Ultimately, their story transformed from a tale of betrayal and broken trust into one of survival, healing, and the power of truth to transform even the most devastating circumstances into opportunities for deeper understanding and stronger relationships.